All right, I have a lot to say, and some of you will think that this is completely overthinking it and unnecessary. I get that, but this is my attempt to be as accurate, truthful, and honest as I possibly can. So that's what I'm going to do. I love Opeth. This is an album they made. Let's talk about it. Hello everyone, these are the different sections that are in the video. You can check those out for yourself with the chapters down below if you want to hear me talk about something specifically. Let's start with a little overview. Writing is very unorthodox, to say the least, and that seems to be Opeth's calling card for a few decades now, but especially in this latest prog rock era that I lovingly call Newpeth. This whole album is very chaotic, definitely evocative, but I'm concerned how integral each of these parts are together as a whole. I will touch more on that later. I've seen a lot of people talk about how much they love this album, and it makes me have to wonder how much of that love is just people liking big things go boom, and maybe a little bit of, wow, I didn't expect that. I mean, I don't know. I kind of did. One of the things that I think would help someone better contextualize this is not an album you're supposed to be looking at as a collection of songs, like little individual things that live on their own. These are just different pieces of a greater piece. This should be looked at as an album in full, much like the last album, Count of Venom. And I think that's even more clearly driven home by the fact that most of the song titles on this don't have their own unique identity. They're just paragraphs 1 through 7, as in a last will and testament. I mean, yes, it does fit the theme that this is about this guy's last will and testament, but it also is a signal to the audience that this is a unified whole. These are not meant to be split apart without context of each other. For a modern audience, this will cause a lot of frustration, but also, fuck those people. And to that end, it's a little hard for me to get that overarching unity that these emotions of the whole album are trying to convey. And maybe that's literally the point, that like going through this last will and testament is chaotic and something you don't really want to face. I can't say that I really enjoy listening to that super much, but at least I can say I would understand that. But anyway, let's dive into the tracks individually. Paragraph 1. So this was the first single off of the record, and now having heard the entire record, I really do not envy them having to pick singles off of this record. Wow. There's just like nothing inviting and accessible about this at all. As of now, paragraph 1 is still my favorite track on the album. That main riff is just too freaking infectious, dude. It's gnarly. I made a whole reaction video when that single got dropped. The main content of that video, my opinions haven't really changed. So, I mean, if you want to see more of what I thought, you can go check that out. The only thing that was different from the single cut was the outro. That's kind of the segue into the next track with this really beautiful orchestration, and it establishes this foreshadowing theme. This is one of the rare moments where we get some thematic glue to tie this album together. Not only does this theme foreshadow the very last track of the album, but it's also quite reminiscent of two other Opeth songs. They have the last track from Count of Venom, forget the name offhand. All Things Will Pass, that's the name. But it also reminds me a little bit of Faith in Others off of Pale Communion. So that was welcome. If they keep making outro songs that sound exactly like this, it's probably going to get old for me eventually, but right now I like it. The only thing that I would add to my commentary on P1 is that I would definitely give it a plus sign now. The song kills. Paragraph 2. I mean, I would say that the fact that I have to listen to the song again while I was typing out my script really is not a great sign. The most memorable aspect of this track is the little groovy riff that's happening while the guy's doing spoken word from the document over top of it. The intro keys are really cool. Love those intro keys. And then it just like jarringly breaks your neck going into this next riff which took me a few listens to realize that was even in 6/8. I'll be honest, still really don't like that part. The following down section after that and the theme there does set up the following groovy section, the aforementioned groovy section, really well. And then the next transition out of the groove into another down section just feels very confused. There's just so many scene changes happening so quickly that things begin to get muddled. Especially when each one of these scene changes has like whole themes that could be developed into their own songs. And I think there's like a smidge of repetition. Another random call out around 3:35, there's a section of this song that sounds like Opeth's take on Norwegian Wood by the Beatles.
Snow made white the street of her dreams. I wanted a girl, or should I say, she wanted me.
That was just kind of neat. Overall, this is probably my least favorite track. Is it bad? No. Even if all of the ideas seem disconnected, none of them feel useless. Does that make sense? I will come back to this idea a few times in the video. Paragraph 3, this is the second single off the album. And when I first heard it, I was kind of like meh about the whole thing, to the point where I didn't feel like I really wanted to make a video about it. After getting the full context of the album, this track made more sense to me. Even just the fact that on my first listen, I didn't even realize paragraph 2 ended and then paragraph 3 began, because there's been so many jarring changes up to this point. Even though there is like a dead stop, that's not the first dead stop we've done, you know? The riff comes in and it's like instantly familiar. And I'm like, oh, this sounds cool. And I'm like looking at my, like, where is this in the song? I'm like, oh crap, we're on the next song. And that intro riff section kind of feels like a weird rehash and conglomeration of a few riffs from River on Pale Communion. If you know, you know. It was cool to get something familiar, but the rapid feel changes and time signature changes were just a lot. This might be the most forced section on the whole album, maybe. The next groovy section that we come to, the kind of like an establishing riff, like we're catching our ground again, is really good. Love the top line there too. It puts you on edge a bit, but there's also an infectious drive. The flow through this section is quite nice. And at this point, some much needed repetition. The last quarter or so of this song just came across as trying to be different for the sake of being different. Just like constantly running away from diatonicism. To what end? Why are we doing this? This whole last quarter section, the only lyrics associated with this are silent curtsy, tearful bliss, and then in parentheses, God bless you, carnal shame, a secret treaty, the lover's bond. That's it. That's all that's going on in this really awkward, disjunct section. Granted, I could be missing a ton of context, but how in the hell are the emotions elicited by this absolute fucking chaos supposed to be matched up with these lyrics? Like, how is this justified? If you get it, if you like it, please let me know why you enjoyed it in the comments, because, I mean, I would like to understand. This just felt like math homework to me. And then we come to paragraph 4, and okay, this is where the album starts to settle in some. Like, thank the Lord. Less whiplash, more pocket. More smooth and sultry evolution instead of jarring transitions. There are still some like stark scene changes, but there are less of them, and it happens less often. Kind of a groovy keys theme to set us up on the intro, but it's also a little haunting and sets the mood. And then we quickly come to the first theme, which as far as I could tell is actually development off of paragraph 3's main theme, both in the riff and the top line. Pretty cool. Distinct, but familiar. The riff starting at 52 seconds is also very familiar, and I can't quite pin it to new Peth or old Peth. But something hints to me that this is more just Michael's writing voice as opposed to like an intentional tie. The first 1 minute and 40 seconds of this are just packed with tension, just absolutely brimming. Not breakneck or tough to follow, just tense. Then we drop this gorgeous harp interlude that sets us up for one of the best moments of the album. Just a really great stretch, an awesome stretch. The riffing does this call and response with an Ian Anderson flute solo, and man, I am the first to hate flute solos in rock and metal. They just don't belong. And The fact that they were able to make this work so damn well, incredible. This is hands down the best flute solo in any metal song or any rock song, period. That's saying a lot because like putting flute in a metal song is like trying to throw a baby shower in a war trench. They just don't do that. But they absolutely nailed it on this track. The restrained and creepy vamping from the band mixed with the darker timbre and phrasing from the flute, it just married a very classic world to a very haunted and disturbed one seamlessly. Brilliant. Just unto itself a fantastic victory. And then that next transition hit me so hard in the balls. This was the Opeth I was missing. This could have come straight off of Blackwater Park or Watershed. So familiar, so full of longing, a fight against despair, packed with sentiment and a quest for meaning. And then you slap the greatest guitar solo on this record on top of it. Choice. That shit just got me right in the feels, man. Really good. It grooves and locks me in. Enough said. This has grown to be one of my favorite tracks on the album. Plus sign. Paragraph 5. This is one of the most consistent tracks on the album. This track basically has two main colors, like this pocketed groove with a pentatonic emphasis and acoustic instruments. And then the other color that it's contrasted against is this dissonant, probably diminished scale type of vibe with distorted guitars and then splashes of rhythmic chaos. These two different contrasting colors alternate in a satisfying way. The intro is gorgeous, light, twinkly orchestra segue, and then sets us up for that aforementioned groove. And that groove section specifically feels like it should be from the new Opeth era, but I don't really think I've ever heard Opeth do something like that before. Maybe off of Pale Communion, maybe. Then there's just like this short explosion followed by clapping, like a, which is like adorable and fun. The first 2 minutes has that subtle evolution, and it finally lets loose into that other color, that Opeth chaos. But even though it has the less diatonic scales that it's using, the phrases are more bite-sized and more repetitive, so it's easier for you to grasp onto. We do get a nice guitar solo on here. Not my favorite, but good. I liked it. The structure of this song itself is still quite heterodox, but because the parts and ideas are distinct and smaller in number, you don't feel totally lost when they take structure liberties in their writing. The groove, the jam, the riff that we end on is one of the best on the record. I love it. It is like the perfect blend of old Opeth and new Opeth. It's so good. It has a fantastic and instantly memorable melody. And then the worst thing on the entire album happens. Right when I sink into his lead vocal over top of this great groove that I want to appreciate for an extended period of time, it decides after the first lyric phrase to begin fading out for no discernible fucking reason. When I first heard this, I was so irrationally upset. Give us the non-fade out cut, because this is fucking bullshit. All right, on to paragraph 6. Love the drum groove that we start on. Very cool. Especially when it lets loose into these really big, old school, classic rock chords that just have this great brang and ring to them. Like, great attention paid to timbre. Feels very satisfying, especially how they bind to the bass guitar sonically. It is warm, full, and bright. It's just a beautiful balance. And a cool theme, too. I also love the counterpoint between the bass and drums in the next section. Very groovy, very funky. Around 2:30 is probably the most Dream Theater riff I've ever heard Opeth do. And like, I know I've heard it somewhere. I can't pinpoint the darn thing, but I know I've heard that riff somewhere. When I first heard that keyboard solo on paragraph 6, I laughed so hard. And it wasn't because there's anything wrong with it, but because it is so not Opeth. You never hear this keys patch on an Opeth record, ever. This is very classic prog, dorky, like, but it was the exact right choice. Everything from the timbre to the phrasing, it was just nasty. And it just made me laugh so hard because my brain is going, I should normally hate this. That keyboard solo absolutely destroys. Best keyboard solo I've ever heard from Opeth. No notes. And a sick guitar solo too. They really complement one another, the keys and the guitar. Aside from one specific jarring transition in this track, I would say the evolution on this song is quite subtle. And then the outro down section feels like something you might find on like Ghost Reveries or Damnation. Whimsical, pensive, gentle. way to take us out. Paragraph 7. I never remember what this intro riff is before it comes on. I just know that I always get a stank face when it starts playing. It's a great, dank, dark way to bring us back in. I think this is also a great moment to take a minute to recognize there's really not a ton of hooks or extremely memorable themes on this record. There are good ones, there are more memorable ones, but not like super hooky. I don't think that's inherently bad, but it does add to the challenge of appreciating it. And many of its best themes are used once and never returned to. Thanks for that. They aren't indulged in, and I would like to indulge just a little more in some of these, please. Anyway, the next riff section that we develop into actually kind of reminds me of early Baroness, like Red Album, Blue Album. I also love how creepy the first down section is. Excellent theming for non-diatonic scales. Follow that up with another classic prog keys line that takes us into some very serious chaos. When this awkward, non-diatonic keys repetition is the thing that is actually solidifying me to the ground as opposed to the guitars or the drums, it's a bit much. It's very hard for me to follow the downbeat on the drums or the guitar there. 416 has the closest thing to a Christian choir you're ever going to find on an Opeth record. And then for 2 minutes, we just kind of jam out on some swampy creepiness. That's the best way I would describe it. Swampy creepiness. Like every character in the story is just unsatisfied and stuck accepting that shitty things are as they are. I can picture them giving each other these disappointed and worrying glances and just this resignment as they put on their cloaks and go back to their carriages to ride home to their respected domiciles. Overall, this track I would say is like the spookiest, you know, like a freaking Scooby-Doo villain creeping down the hallway type of deal, you know?
I call it like the tiptoe riff. It's like really cheeky. It sounds like somebody like tiptoeing down the corridor.
It has good unity of form, even having such weird ideas and structure. And then the final track, The Story Never Told. This is the easiest to digest by far. This song is the least jarring and has the least dramatic contrast. It has a great theme that, like I said, reminds me of the closers from Ink Out of Venom and Pale Communion. And like I also mentioned, was foreshadowed in the paragraph 1 segue. Very pretty top line and vocal performance across the whole track. And the vocal performance specifically was just like very gentle and caring. A soul finally at rest, or at least as restful as he can allow himself to be. Again, an atypical form, but it's for the most part one theme represented a bunch of different ways. A few short departures from that theme, but just relatively low contrast, especially in comparison to the rest of the album. That solo is definitely the most soulful on the album, and you don't really hear Frederick go outside of his pocket too often. And I don't mean that as a bad thing. It's kind of like emoting as though you can barely get a grasp or a handle on these feelings that are inside of you. I really like that. I will also say it doesn't feel like the most satisfying ending to me. It's pretty, but by the end I just don't feel like I was fulfilled with this entire trek across the album. Maybe that's also because I just didn't love the entire journey the entire time. Maybe in the future I'll come to love it more, but just as of now I'm just like, but why? So to sum all of that up, on the first listen, while there were some moments that did engage me immediately, I would say as a whole, the album felt a bit up its own ass. Don't get me wrong, I could tell immediately that this is going to take a few listens to really digest and give a fair shake to. But I mean, I've been around this block enough times to where sometimes you can just tell when the artist is masturbating. I don't know how to say that clearly. Masturbating. When the artist is masturbating or they're just publicly navel-gazing for you to witness. After 6 or more spins, many of the sections make a lot more sense to me. But then there's still sections to where it just seems like needlessly confusing and contrived. I'm open to hearing and actually excited to hear why other people might actually love those sections. I would like to learn. But I really want to emphasize here, it did take me years to finally fully appreciate Ink Out of Venom, and even to this day, there's still parts of that album I think are disjunct and dorky, and I love it. Maybe the same will happen with me in this album in the future. I hope. That'd be great. Let's move on to the production. One word. Wow. It is not the most polished, or really I should say modern production, though everything is clean and well separated, and I would say timbres have a great balance to them. In this prog rock era, the drums kind of felt a little dull, a little dead, and that's because they weren't like really hyped on the highs. This, it doesn't feel like they're hyped much at all, if at all, but they still feel natural and old school. And man, those drums are bone dry with like a low to mid level of compression. And I am happy that they did that because it really emphasized how good the new drummer's touch is. Here is his name and his face on screen. I am an ignorant American, so I'm not pronouncing that. But this man absolutely crushes on this album. And after having read the Book of Opeth, and then hearing some of the stories about how Martin Lopez wasn't great playing to the click in studio, I'm probably gonna say this new drummer is the best drummer Opeth has ever had. He is nasty. And this more natural production style really allows his performance to shine. He's a good enough performer to shine, instead of mixing him to death and sample supplementing him into vanilla sausage. And what I was most impressed about is how this was combined with the guitars, and there's some serious dynamic range for how distorted those guitars are. Trying to maintain dynamic range is just outside of the vocabulary of most modern metal productions. And they kept dynamic range, and they established it as a classic yet modern sound while still competing with modern metal productions. Specifically, that guitar tone almost felt like they were trying to reinvent the Ghost Reverie's guitar tone. It had that Bogren era bright mids with a mild bottom. The one from the Bogren era had like no bottom at all, but this one had some bottom to it. But on these guitars, you fully felt the transients. They felt great. This is also by far the most orchestra I've ever heard on an Opeth record, and it is very welcome. It is a beautiful coloring to add to our primary colors. It also aesthetically ties the old and the new. I mean, symphonic metal is so prominent these days that culturally I could say that's new, at least in the metal scene. So it really like blends those two so well. The lead vocal mix on this record was very upfront in a lot of sections. And then there's other sections where it's almost kind of buried a bit, but it wasn't like, that's not like an insult. Like they did that on purpose for vibe. And you can especially tell because usually when it's buried a little more, it's also heavy with effects. I would argue this album competes with their greatest productions they've ever done. It isn't the same as Blackwater Park, Damnation, or Ghost Reveries. It certainly is not as comfortable, but this production, in my humble opinion, is the greatest thing that this record achieved. The ability to seamlessly blend a bunch of genres together, not to mention different decades of production styles, not to mention both eras of Opeth, just like mind-bending. It comfortably fits into all of those different things. That's wild. What a beautiful synthesis. And it didn't try to outshine other mixing engineers with mixing tricks. They only mixed it as much as they needed to mix it in order for the timbres and performances to shine. This allowed the record's natural personality to shine through. Absolutely brilliant. I give the production a 10 out of 10.
You got a 10 out of 10. You go to the store and you get 10 out of 10.
Sadly, on this video, I will not be diving really far into the story or the lyrics. They are usually the last thing of interest to me. I will be touching on them more later, but if you're interested in knowing more about the story or like how it's delivered and everything, I would recommend first listening to the album for yourself, but then also checking out this interview that Ola did talking to Michael. He explains a bunch of it, and it's actually really cool. I will be honest, when I first read through these lyrics, I missed a bunch of context that thankfully you fans filled me in on. Appreciate that. I have a hard time deriving context from Opeth lyrics sometimes just because, like, I don't know, is this a cliche or is this have like a deeper underlying meaning that has a literal context to the story, you know? Other people had no problem parsing that out, so apparently I missed something. So also, in fairness, I don't feel like I'm prepared to really judge them. So let's move on from there. So then the question becomes, is Last Will and Testament good? Well, let's evaluate its goodness. I came up with some methods for that. Here are the different categories of goodness that I was able to parse out. Let's start with taste. So for my individual tastes, there are things that I really liked about it, as you heard, but I would say that the majority of this record isn't sticking with me, at least not yet. Most of the stuff in my brain is tracks 1 and 4. At this point, I almost respect the album more than I enjoy it. Does that make sense? I don't know how often I'll be coming back to this or not. tough to say right now. I'll absolutely be coming back to paragraphs 1 and 4. Like I said, it took me years to fall in love with Incauda, so who knows? For this album, the jury of my taste is still out. For my very subjective and picky taste, I would say I don't know if I like this or not. Next, let's look at utility. Assuming the utility in this case is just blanketly scratching an itch, or if it's also trying to push the art of music forward, I would say it probably accomplishes both of those things, at least to a degree, especially given the response I've seen online. It is a very challenging record. A challenging record that has some very real imagination, originality, merit. If another part of its utility is presenting a challenge to its audience towards the end goal of helping them achieve a novel aesthetic catharsis, I think at very least it gets close. For how this album is meant to be used and for how this album is practically being used, I would say it has good utility. Let's judge it definitionally, as in the definition of music. On a basic level, yes, this is recognizable as music. Though, because the record is so challenging, I would put it more in the category of challenging existing paradigms or existing definitions of music and composition, trying to expand these definitions. It challenges definitions of songwriting convention for sure. It challenges the definition of both prog and metal, and especially modern metal with that production. And it also challenges the definition of a concept record. I haven't heard a concept record like that before, especially when you are not looking at the songs as these individual experiences, but as a greater whole, like a classical work. It definitely is recognizable as competent music, for sure. So on that alone, we could say it's good. As far as how successful it is at changing people's conceptions of music, I think the jury might still be out on that, but I'd lean towards a yes myself. It will change people's definitions of music. As a matter of fact, it's already inspired me, but I'll get to that towards the end of the video. All right, is the song psychologically good? For those uninitiated, I am of the belief, based upon Perlovsky's theory, that music provides a very necessary psychological function in the human mind. And aside from that, there's other many well-documented psychological benefits as well. But getting to the album and judging its psychological goodness, there's definitely moments on this album where I can feel some cognitive dissonance relief. I was actually listening to the album while typing up this very part of the script, and it was actually helping me stay focused and drive further and get my ideas translated to paper faster. Provided me some dopamine, some serotonin, felt great. For a prog and metal fandom, I would say this will be psychologically helpful to most of them. However, the pop brain will refuse to understand this. If a person who mostly engages in pop culture and pop music tries to consume this album, I think you have the potential to create far more cognitive dissonances in that poor soul's brain. This album runs far away from catchy hooks. And even for me, it's been difficult to recognize when we come back to established themes and riffs in the same song. It is exciting. It is also inspiring, but there are also moments where I notice I get some cognitive dissonance listening to this darn thing, even as a prog lover. I just worry that they may have tried to go a little bit too far outside the box on this one. I even mentioned that at the end of the album, I didn't really get a sense of fulfillment, which great music should accomplish. By the end of that last track, I was just like, oh, that's it? Like, what? This album did inspire me, but as a craftsman, not a consumer. Again, I'll talk about that more later. So, in my personal estimation, psychologically, I would say it is good for a narrow audience. A certain audience will feel empathized with and inspired, but I think this will fly past most other people. I think if your average pop listener picks this up, they are probably going to be presented with more problems than solutions. So how does the album fare on an aesthetic analysis? This may be the most difficult to evaluate. The most interesting and wonderful thing is seeing the perfect union of old Peth and new Peth. Like that alone being so seamless is beautiful. There's so many moments that remind me of the Wilson Bogren era, and there's also plenty of moments that remind me from the prog rock era. These two eras so drastically contrasted against one another, brought together in a beautiful union. Just as a blanket statement, it's a very emotionally evocative album, for sure. My greatest concern when it comes to evaluating the aesthetics of this is really its unity. The first listen was very jarring, especially on tracks 2 and 3. The songs in general avoid an easily discernible structure, which is not inherently bad. But when you avoid discernible structure, it makes it difficult to create a sense of unity. Not to mention, one of the most challenging aspects of this album is Opeth running away from diatonicism just because. Those parts are either the most goofy parts or the most awesome parts. There's like no two ways around it. You can say, oh, diatonic scales are just a cultural construct. Yeah, but there's math and physiological realities that underlie that. They're like, that's why they've been cropping up independently. Diatonic scales and their derivatives crop up independently in just about every culture across the entire world. So because it is so ingrained into the human musical experience, when you start venturing away from that stuff, you start heading into some very uncomfortable emotions. And then by extension, the challenge of joining the audience with beauty becomes more difficult. Pair that with the drastic scene changes, the metric modulations, some seemingly random placements of odd time signatures. It's a lot to take in and like try and identify as anything but confusing. And to be fair to this album, I think you need at least 3 listens to give this a fair shake. Is it worth it to give this many listens? For some, I would say yeah. And I mean, even for the uninitiated to experimental or prog music, I would say it'd be a worthy endeavor just to try and expand their frame of reference. Like, even with my critiques of this album, there's tons of merit to be found. The prominent emotions and aesthetics that I hear and feel elicited would be angst, rage, horror, surprise, dementia, intrigue, mystery, dinge, mist, twinkle, conflict, and dissonance. From a romantic mimesis perspective, I think that Opeth were hitting on some like real authentic human emotions or human circumstances from time to time, like that were definitely felt with me. The pacing and order in which some of these circumstances were assembled didn't immediately ring true. And even just looking at some individual moments, there's just things I don't emotionally understand. And I have to wonder, is it just me? Am I the one who's not getting it? Or on the flip side, is this just being different for different sake? I'm more inclined towards the former, but something really nags at me about the latter. The more listens I give, the better I understand it. I better anticipate the next section and how it kind of makes sense. Like, I'm starting to get used to Michael's logic and getting in his head on what he was hearing and feeling. But even then, there's like plenty of small sections that just kind of become train wrecks. But to the album's credit, those moments usually last a short amount of time. And most of them are towards the front of the album. Now that's just looking at music with its semantic ambiguity. When we contextualize the aesthetics with the lyrics, I think this is the weakest part of the album. The emotions elicited by the music do not match the lyrics to me, conceptually or emotionally, like through poetry. Like, I can like stretch it to make sense and justify it, right? Some of the poetic imagery like fits on a certain just like blanketly dark and gruesome horror level. But the underlying story moments paired with the music moments just do not feel like they actually match well to me. I think taken overall with how disconnected, sudden, shocking, and horrifying some of these music sounds are, you can argue that that fits with the overall story, and I would agree with that. A group of heirs going through their father's last will and testament and discovering secrets that rock their world. So the jarring sections, in conjunction with the more meditative, repetitive sections, kind of gives you this ebb and flow of something that completely changes your perspective on reality, and then having to learn how to accept it. Overall, that works. But the moment you zoom into one song, let alone a section of a song, and then you try to match that emotionally to what's happening in the lyrics, that's where it breaks down for me. It does not ruin the album for me at all, because I mean, I'm never coming to Opeth albums for lyrics. But I think it's a level of analysis worth bringing up. I'd be interested to know what you think down in the comments below about whether you think the music actually matches the story elements, like individually. What emotion gets elicited from music has a very strong subjective component, so that's also something that I could be missing. All in all, I'd say there's some very real victories on this album, and then other moments that make me question whether or not it was a victory. And keep in mind, this is getting into the nitty gritty. Like, how much can I analyze this? There are still many moments on this album I thoroughly enjoyed aesthetically. There are some evolutions and developments that felt very cool, very natural, evocative, and infectious. So overall, if you don't look at it too closely, the aesthetics are clearly good, at very least evocative. This album isn't the most nuanced and not the most unified, but it's still cool and fun. All right, I'm about to become a very unpopular person online. Let's evaluate the morality of Last Will and Testament. Now, I don't know a ton about Michael Ackerfeld's personal beliefs or philosophy. As far as I know, he's pretty much a nihilist, right? Please do correct me if I am wrong. I am a practicing Catholic, so that will be the baseline for my moral framework. And lastly, if I misinterpret any of the story or theme content on this album, please correct me in the comments as well. I do have this penchant for missing obvious things in Opeth lyrics. Let's begin with, I was very surprised to see direct references to Christianity here. Like, not only that, but it appears to be applied in a very positive context. I'd like sit and ask myself for a moment, like, is Michael Ackerfeld like possibly considering Christianity? And then I opened the liner notes, and there, in all caps, it said, "Hail Ball." And then things became much clearer. From what I can discern of the lyrics, it seems like there's themes of wanting redemption, but maybe having too much cowardice to try and find that redemption before you die. Themes of the fleetingness of legacy and heritage, themes of the corruption of power and wealth. I wouldn't call this an indictment of rich people, really, so the Marxists will probably be disappointed with the lack of conviction. But through all the chaos and pain, I think there actually is some brightness on the other side of this journey. There's something that resembles hope. And in Christianity, hope is one of the big three. As far as I can tell, there's nothing that really flies in the face of any major moral system in the world, so it's not really like controversial in any way. Maybe like the nitpicking Christian with no nuance would be like, oh, they talk about sex and infidelity. It's like, yeah, but they're very clearly not celebrating it. This is like a warning, a cautionary tale, you know? Not only that, it's not like they're really that explicit about the whole thing. Like if you're a parent, maybe you don't let your child listen to it if they're not ready to listen to it. That's about the extent I could see. And that is certainly not an indictment of the message itself. As far as I can tell, the album doesn't really make any claims about inherent meaning anywhere. So I would say it welcomes both the perspectives of like a nihilist and an eternalist. I don't know. This seems like a bullshit term, but I couldn't find a different word that's the opposite of nihilist. Yeah, from multiple angles, from what I can tell, this is a morally solid album. I would place this album on the good side of morality. And if you disagree with my analysis, I would love to know why in the comments below. So overall, I would say the album is good, but is it great? Well, let's see where I would place it amongst the other albums I have evaluated of Opeth. I made a tier list of all the Opeth albums a few years ago, so let's bring that up. So in the good category, I placed Pale Communion, Deliverance. I didn't have quite as defined of an idea of what good meant at the time, but I think for now we can take it on face value. On production alone and Heir Apparent being such a frickin' banger, that album went into excellent tier, watershed. And I still do stand by that, even with kind of inconsistent quality of the compositions holding my attention. I definitely think Last Will and Testament is better than Watershed. Like, almost certainly. And I imagine there's a lot of Opeth fans who agree with me. Okay, so I think it'd be fair to call this album excellent, even with all my critiques, even with not even being sure if I like it or not. Is it better than Still Life? For me, this is a bit of a toss-up, and I know there's a bunch of people who just lost their minds when I said that. I can tell you, not only do I definitely like Incauda Venenum more than Last Will and Testament, I think it's like provably a better album. So as of now, I would not say Last Will and Testament hits the classic tier, but I think it could be argued that this is an excellent album. Now, just thinking about this album in its own context, as opposed to in context of all of the other Opeth albums, going with my gut feeling, it's definitely good, but is it actually excellent? There's still something in my gut that holds me back, that keeps me reserved. And I think it's because there's certain parts I definitely don't enjoy still, and because of the lack of unity that I'm perceiving so far. The three albums I have in the classic tier have very strong unity. Incauda Venenum has fantastic unity. Still Life has some, but not quite as strong. I mean, it was a whole vibe in that era, and I appreciate what they were doing at the time. This one, I still don't know. I could change my mind in the future, but I don't know. For now, I think I'm okay with just calling it excellent. I think I can confidently say this is an excellent album. And then the last section, why is this album important? After my first 2 listens of this album, it actually kind of unlocked something for me in my brain. Like, this legit helped me quite a lot. Since I've been slowly but surely working on a new record with my band, this could not have come at a better time. It spoke to me on an artist craftsmanship level, and I'll get to that. But first, I think we should compare this album from 2 different perspectives. First, let's compare the lead Opeth single with the lead Dream Theater single. The radio edit for paragraph 1 was 4:47, and when the final album track dropped, it was 5:57. The only thing cut from the edit was the outro segue, that whole orchestration at the end. It just wasn't wasting people's time with just like inserting this out of context section that in the album has context and great utility, but like on its own, it's kind of like, okay, why am I still listening to this? Like, the real thing we would consider like the song was there in the radio edit and the final album version. You could argue that that outro was not a part of the composition. It just really serves as a segue. Now, by contrast, Dream Theater's new single Night Terror had a radio edit come out, and it came at 6:01, 6 minutes and 1 second. Okay, that seems like normal. The original album length is 10 fucking minutes. If you can delete almost half the song and then publish that as though this is acceptable for people to listen to, I think you wasted a ton of people's fucking time. What in the world makes you think I need to listen to the other 4 minutes? What? Those weren't important enough for radio? You know, that thing that you're definitely gonna get placed on? That track at full length was so incredibly over repetitive and a slog. Like, I'll give the bridge credit, but there's so much fucking wasted space there. The meat to waste ratio was crap. With all the talk I've just done of how weird and hard to grasp onto this new Opeth album was, just drawing that contrast to the radio edit of the single, every single moment of this album, even as jarring and what the fuck some of these moments were, doesn't feel wasted or useless. This is one of the fastest 50 minutes you will ever experience. It flew by. This album just charges right on through relentlessly, and it's always giving you something to pay attention to. And bloat is something that Opeth themselves have had struggles with in the past. It's a common problem for prog bands. This album is ambitious, but it doesn't take its audience for granted, and that to me is a hell of a feat. Considering the context of Dream Theater, there was nothing on that single I considered ambitious whatsoever, and it bored the shit out of me for half of it. Prog that isn't overly self-indulgent and actually gives a shit about entertaining the audience and like giving them something to pay attention to, yeah, that's important. And then the other comparison I will make is to Metallica. I think personally the reason why we've been getting so much bland work over the last few albums is because they care too much about what their fans think. I have a sneaking suspicion, this is speculation, that James Hetfield really wants to be making Southern folk records and not metal records. I don't hear his heart in writing Metallica songs anymore, and Lord knows I haven't heard Lars's heart in this stuff in forever. Those drum parts are droll at best. I still believe James has a lot that he wants to say, but this ain't the way he wants to say it. And then the social pressure on Metallica between the legacy of the band itself and the fans just pressuring them to just chug monotony and mediocrity as this dual flavor of bullshit. So instead of James facing the music, he's put out substandard compositions that he probably really doesn't give a shit about. Again, this is speculation. I could be completely wrong. But those are the vibes I'm picking up. It has been very clear, especially since Heritage, that Michael Ackerfeld cares more about expressing himself honestly than he does pandering to his audience. He obviously respects and loves his fans, but he's not going to appease them to their every whim. He's willing to challenge them and to make himself vulnerable. He's interested in trying to say something that hasn't been said before. That confidence to make something that you know full well is damn good, even if you don't know who is actually going to appreciate it, that's beautiful. That's an artist. The second listen on this album helped me feel more freedom to be honest in my compositions, not worrying so much about whether people like it or not. I mean, it's something you want to consider. I mean, you want people to like it, right? But not like unhealthily so. Like, I don't know, a few other bands I might have mentioned today. Having confidence in the quality of my own work as opposed to trying too hard to be relatable or to impress someone. Those who get the album will get the album, and glory be to God. Granted, Opeth has built up a ton of goodwill over the decades, so they can get away with trying something like this. If I released this record, it would almost certainly not get picked up by anyone. But I don't have to be this ambitious to still write honestly and know that it's high quality. So from the bottom of my heart, from one Michael to another, thank you very much for making this album. It means a lot to me, and I learned something important. So those are my thoughts. I'd love to know yours. Be well. God bless. I love you.